Melissa's mother-in-law had just finished digging in the vegetable garden when she came into the house for a drink of water. Her brother-in-law, Brian, was still lying on the bed in the heat, barely moving as the day faded. He mumbled something to her and forced himself to get up. Melissa's mother-in-law had never seen him as a helper. She didn't ask this selfish man to follow her around the garden, pulling weeds, weeding, or watering the vegetables. She did all the work herself, her hands calloused from years of tilling and planting, and she knew Brian wouldn't lift a finger to help. But in the fall and winter, she wouldn't let him touch the canning and demanded money for it, because Brian never helped. So in the fall and winter, Melissa's business flourished. She was proud of the rows of canned vegetables, each jar representing her hard work. Brian loved to eat, and every month he unlocked the door and looked directly at the vegetable garden, watching Melissa work. He often thought about the fresh vegetables that came into the kitchen, the ripe tomatoes and crisp cucumbers. Melissa was just crossing to the other side of the vegetable garden, to the tomatoes and greenhouse, and droplets of sweat appeared on her forehead. Brian plucked up the courage to follow her, but Melissa didn't notice him right away. She was diligently watering, concentrating solely on tending the plants. Melissa walked into the greenhouse, bent down to the ground, and began picking green cucumbers like her grandmothers had done. At this time, she thought of Brian. He loved the little cucumbers, not slicing them, but eating them all at once, savoring the crisp freshness. She smiled, remembering the times she'd watched him nonchalantly devour them. Suddenly, Brian came up behind her and put his arm around Melissa to keep her from falling. She didn't say anything to Brian. Although she thought of her husband, she had no one else. Loneliness was creeping up on her, and although she hadn't expected it, her son-in-law's presence warmed her. So Melissa didn't chase Brian away, but decided to see what would happen next. What happened next was something Melissa had never imagined. She only had time to sigh because Brian was unstoppable. He was gentle yet insistent, his hands holding her waist tightly. It seemed to her that Brian, who had never helped before, was now good enough and she could get what she wanted. There was something primal about this moment, the warmth of the greenhouse surrounding them and the smell of the earth mingling with their sweat. After helping her son-in-law so much, Melissa hugged him and, smiling, told him that if he continued to help her like that, he would be allowed to sunbathe for free. She laughed, trying to take the incident lightly, but deep down she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Later, as she was preparing a meal, she beckoned Brian to join her in the kitchen. When he entered the kitchen, Melissa felt as if she had been electrocuted. Her whole body seemed to come alive when he was near. She had a feeling for him that she couldn't define, but it was undeniable. How had this happened? She had never felt this way about him before. The sun must have made her dizzy, Melissa thought, but when Brian came over and kissed her, she couldn't deny it anymore. At that moment, Melissa pressed herself against him, and his arms involuntarily wrapped around her. It was unforgettable, and right there in the kitchen, such an abyss of heat washed over them that the plates on the table almost started bouncing. Needless to say, the two of them were very heated at that moment. The smell of the food and the clinking of dishes brought back memories that neither of them would be able to forget. Taking a breath, they sat down at the table. Brian poured a shot glass and made a toast. He raised the shot glass, his eyes met hers, and there was a tangible connection between them. Melissa was very pleased with how her relationship with her son-in-law was progressing, and they sat and talked and drank and told each other about themselves. They talked about their lives, dreams and fears, things they had never talked about before. It was as if a wall had broken down between them, and for the first time they saw each other not just as family, but as individuals. And when it was time to go to bed, they went to their room, where their bond became even stronger. The night was filled with whispers and confessions, touches that conveyed what words couldn't. From that night on, their relationship became different, deeper, more meaningful. They no longer tiptoed behind each other, but embraced what they found in each other. In the days that followed, Melissa and Brian found moments to be together in the garden, in the kitchen, or even in the quiet evening hours when the rest of the family was asleep. Melissa looked forward to these moments, her heart pounding in anticipation. She had never imagined that her son-in-law, whom she had once considered lazy and selfish, would become such an important person to her. Brian began to change too. He began to help more, not only in the garden but also around the house, doing things that brought a smile to Melissa's face. He was drawn to her not only for her beauty, but also for her strength and resilience. One particularly hot afternoon, Melissa suggested they relax and sunbathe, They spread towels in the garden, and while they basked in the sun, Brian reached out and took her hand. It was such a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. Melissa turned her head in his direction, her eyes met his, and in that moment she realized that she had made the right choice in letting him into her life. They spent the rest of the day laughing and talking, sharing stories from their past and dreaming of the future. The garden that had once been a place of labor became their sanctuary, a place where they could be themselves without fear or judgment. And so as the days turned into weeks, Melissa and Brian's bond continued to grow. They were no longer just mother-in-law and son-in-law, they were partners, confidants, and friends. Their relationship was unconventional, but it worked, and that was what mattered. Melissa no longer felt alone, she had Brian, and together they worked through any challenges that came their way. Their friendship, born in an unexpected moment in the greenhouse, blossomed, and they knew that as long as they had each other, they could handle anything life threw their way. One day, as Melissa and Brian sat in the garden enjoying the cool evening breeze, Brian started talking about his dreams. He talked about wanting to travel, to see places he had only read about. Melissa listened intently, keeping her eyes on his face. She saw the passion in his eyes, the desire to go beyond their little world. It was then that she realized how much she wanted to share those dreams with him. She'd never thought about traveling before, but the thought of going to new places with Brian made her heart race with excitement. They talked about the places they wanted to visit, the adventures they hoped to have. It was in those quiet moments, as the sun set behind them, that they realized they were no longer just living day to day, they were planning a future together. Melissa began to notice small changes in Brian. He became more attentive, more caring, and took every opportunity to show her how much she meant to him. He brought her flowers from the garden, made her coffee in the mornings, and left little notes that she found throughout the day. Every gesture, no matter how small, made Melissa feel very cherished. She had never experienced love like this before, tender, patient, and unwavering. Brian had become a pillar for her, someone she could lean on, and every day she fell in love with him more and more. Their moments together became more frequent and warmer. At night they sat under the stars, holding each other and sharing their hopes and fears. Melissa felt like she was finally living, not just existing. Every day the bond between them grew stronger and stronger, and soon it was impossible to hide their feelings. They no longer cared who knew about their relationship, they were proud of what they had built together. It wasn't normal, but it was real, and that was what mattered. One evening as they sat on the porch, Brian turned to Melissa and took her hand. He looked into her eyes and told her how much she meant to him. He talked about how she had changed his life, how she had made him a better man. Melissa felt tears come to her eyes as she listened to his words. She had never imagined that she could mean so much to someone, that she could have such a profound impact on another person's life. She squeezed his hand, her heart overflowing, and she told him that he had done the same for her. Their story of friendship wasn't typical, but it was their story. They had found each other in the most unexpected circumstances, and together they had built something beautiful. Melissa knew that as long as Brian was by her side, she could withstand anything. The future was uncertain, but she was no longer afraid. They had each other, and that was enough. And as they sat there, hand in hand, watching the sun sink below the horizon, they knew that this was only the beginning of their journey together. They had faced challenges, overcome obstacles, and found love in places they never expected. And they knew without a doubt that they would continue to overcome anything that came their way together.